As opposed to this, we see the philosophy of Hippocrates. Now, in Bress, he says, the physician sees terrible things and touches on the loathsome, and from others' misfortunes harvests troubles of his own. So here we see the physician caring about the individual. In his oath, he says, I will not give a poison to anyone who asks to do so, nor will I suggest such a plan. In the same way, I'll not give a pessary to a woman to cause an abortion. But note this last line here, but in purity and in holiness, I will guard my life and my art. So let me pause just for a second. Let's look at that first line. I will not give a poison to anyone who asks to do so. In ancient Greece, they couldn't control pain. We struggle with it oftentimes today. So sometimes patients would come and talk to their physician and say, can you help me end my life? Yeah, I just can't live with this pain. Let me escape. So in Hippocrates said, I will not give a poison to anyone though asked to do so, nor will I suggest such a plan. So the question I ask is why? Well, it turns out Hippocrates was a Pythagorean. He believed with the Pythagoreans that human life was a gift from the gods, that there was something special about the individual. So there is something special about human life. So he couldn't take that human life even if the patient was coming asking him to do so. And this is reflected, but in purity and in holiness. If life was a gift from the gods, then it was a violation of that higher moral code. So Hippocrates was subjecting himself to a law higher than Hippocrates, higher than himself, higher than man. And that's part of the breakdown we're seeing of the rule of law today, which is the breakdown that leads to the loss of property rights. And eventually, as I explain in my book, it leads to the loss of sovereignty of the United States. And he goes on to say in precepts, for if love of men is present, love of the art is also present. So here we see it's sort of like a compass. Instead of a north and a south, it's sort of an H and a P. So to one side we have Hippocrates, who believed that the human life was special, looked at the individual as the basis of thought. Whereas P, for Plato, looking at the good of the collective. So in ancient Greece, actually, the people starts towards P. And with just free market forces over the next few hundred years, it swings over towards H. You can imagine if you're a patient getting up in age and your knees hurt and your hips hurt and your back hurts and your neck hurts, and you decide, okay, I'm going to go see a physician. Which physician are you going to see? Are you going to see the physician that's looking out for the good of the whole, good of the collective, or looking out for you as an individual? So free market forces, patients gravitate towards the Hippocratic physician, and the needle stays there for about 2,000 years. So this is sort of the pole that we're looking at. And it continues to point towards Hippocrates up until the late 1800s. Here's a 14th century Christianized version of the oath. So as Judeo-Christian thought sort of captures the West, it sort of drags Hippocratic thought with it. It stays there up until the late 1800s with the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche. Turns out Nietzsche specifically addresses the moral code for physicians in Twilight of the Atoms. Now we're looking for patterns in thought. Quote, the invalid is a parasite on society. In a certain state, it is indecent to go on living. To vegetate on in cowardly dependence on physicians and medications ought to entail after the meaning of life, or even the right to life has been lost, ought to entail a profound contempt of society. Physicians, in their turn, ought to be the communicators of this contempt. Not prescriptions, but every day a fresh dose of disgust for their patients. It's kind of like Plato. It's a little humorous, but you think about what he's saying. We're seeing a very different role of what it means to be a physician in the writings of Nietzsche. He continues to create a new responsibility, that of the physician, in all cases in which the highest interest of life, or the ascending life, I'll pause there. When we read Nietzsche, the ascending life is the young, the strong, the fit, those that are moving society forward. Okay? And this demands the most ruthless suppression and sequestration of degenerating life. Oh, what's that? It's the elderly, it's the weak, it's the infirm, it's the sick, it's those that are a burden on society. Nietzsche continues, For example, in determining the right to reproduce, the right to be born, in fact, even the right to live. So we see in the writings of Nietzsche the rise of the Third Reich, or following the writings of Nietzsche. And behind me we see a picture of the Dachau hypothermia experiment. Supposedly this was done to learn how to rewarm downed pilots. So they would take their subject or their victim, immerse them in ice water, nearly freeze them to death, and then rewarm them using various methods. Sometimes they put them under scalding lamps, burn their skin, put tubes down through their esophagus, put scalding water in, burn their stomach, or up through their rectum, burn their colon, or open their abdominal cavity, or drop them in vats of scalding oil. If the victim was so unfortunate as to survive, it'd be nearly refrozen and tortured again. So as part of the events following World War II and the Geneva Convention, they tried to reorient medical ethics back to Hippocrates. So we've sort of seen this needle. It starts towards P, swings towards H, writings of Nietzsche back towards P. Now we see with the Geneva Convention, it swings back towards H. What we see now, the last 50 years, is a swing of this needle back towards collectivism, back towards the orientation of Plato. And I'll walk through this very briefly. So initially, the first change was 1949 with the Geneva Convention itself. It didn't include an oath. An oath is a swearing before one's god or gods, is a set of ideals to hold for all time. If you don't include an oath, it's just a list of standards open to revision. Revision is exactly what's happened. 1960, the World Medical Association altered the wording of the Geneva Convention. So human life was no longer sacred from conception. Now it's sacred from, quote, the beginning. And here we see postmodern thought enter in, as you can start to debate when the beginning is. It continues. 1973, abortion's legalized here in the U.S. 1995, Peter Singer writes a book called Should the Baby Live? Now I'm looking for patterns in thought, okay? Now just let me read a paragraph to you. We think that some infants with severe disabilities should be killed. This recommendation may cause particular offense to some readers who are themselves born with disabilities. Now get this next line, this one kills me. Perhaps even the same disabilities we're discussing. So that means there are people listening to his lectures, coming to his talks, reading his books. They have disabilities, but have the mental faculty to argue with him, saying, hey guy, I think you're wrong. He said, perhaps you should have been killed at birth, so you couldn't even argue with me. All right. That's what he means. Perhaps even the same disabilities we're discussing. 1994, same gentleman, Peter Singer, writes, Rethinking Life and Death. This is what got me engaged in this whole process back in the mid-1990s. But we suggest a period of 28 days after birth that might be allowed before the infant is accepted as having the same right to life as others. This is clearly before the infant could have a sense of its own existence over time and allow a couple to decide that it's better not to continue a life that has begun very badly. Kind of reminds you of the writings in World War II of lives not worth living. You start to see two competing worldviews, two definitions of what it means to pursue the good. It's not that the one worldview says, I'm out to pursue evil. They define good differently. Okay, let's keep going. One more. 1997, physician-assisted suicide is legalized in Oregon. 1999, Peter Singer appoints Peter Singer the RWD Camp Chair of Bioethics. Peter Singer is a world-renowned bioethicist. He's holding a major chair teaching at Princeton. So he's this isn't some crazy Berkeley radical in the 1960s that said some wild stuff and was never heard of again. He's very influential. 2008, the Oregon Health Plan refuses Barbara Wagner chemotherapy, instead offers to pay for physician-assisted suicide. This is legal here in the U.S.